There's no single explanation as to why 32nd President Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for a third presidential term. The most popular explanation is that he wanted to keep continuity in the White House as war waged in Europe. But the specifics of when he made the decision, whether it was a difficult one or whether there were ulterior motives, is still debated. Many wonder if he'd always wanted to run for a third term, and if, had he lived through his fourth term, would he have run for a fifth term and possibly pursued a perpetual presidency. At the time Roosevelt ran in 1940, running for a third term wasn't prevented by the Constitution. It wasn't even exceptional. Since the Civil War, every president who had the opportunity to run for a third term either tried to or was at least encouraged to do so. Nevertheless, because of the two-term tradition, a three-term president was always a controversial idea. It's generally agreed that Roosevelt enjoyed many aspects of the presidency: the status, the influence, the connection to the American people, and even the day-to-day activities of politicking. This alone might have made him more open to a third term than many prior presidents, who were often eager about leaving behind the stresses of the office and returning to civilian life. There were signs, however, that during Roosevelt's second term, he might have been planning to follow in his predecessor's footsteps. In April of 1937, early in his second term, he was already making plans for his presidential library, as shown by sketches he made for the library's layout. 2 years later, in 1939, he donated personal and presidential papers to the federal government, pledging part of his estate as the grounds for the library and collecting funds for its construction. His health was another factor. While major issues only became evident during his third term, health problems had plagued him for years. Many of these were believed to be brought on by his sedentary lifestyle, a lifestyle that was forced upon him by the paralysis in his legs, something which in itself was difficult to deal with, especially while carrying on his presidential duties. There was also the question of whether he could even win another election. In hindsight, the third term seems inevitable, especially by looking at election maps and numbers which show his 1940 landslide victory. However, this doesn't paint the full picture or show the events in between elections. During his second term, he faced considerable pushback and legislative defeats. While his Democratic Party dominated Congress, many Democrats worked to block his agenda, with the help of Republicans. His attempts to regain control of his party might have only made matters worse. During the midterm elections, he attempted to purge dissident Democrats and replace them with allies. The move emboldened his opponents and gave them grounds to paint him as a want-to-be tyrant who was overstepping his bounds as president. Even some of Roosevelt's allies began to consider that he might become more of a liability for their cause, and Democrats all over worried that an attempt at a third term might drag down the party as a whole. What Roosevelt's intentions were at this time isn't clear. Publicly, he remained completely silent on the issue, despite being repeatedly questioned by the press. At times, he even seemed annoyed by the question. Those closer to him, however, seemed to have a much clearer impression, and that impression was that he wouldn't be running again. Both Vice President John Nance Garner and Postmaster General James Farley ran campaigns for the 1940 Democratic nomination, reportedly with assurances from Roosevelt that he wouldn't be among the contenders. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt hadn't received such a straightforward answer. However, based on, quote, little things he said at different times, she'd come to believe he wouldn't run and didn't want to. Secretary of State Cordell Hull reported that on numerous occasions, Roosevelt had come to him, trying to persuade him to run in the upcoming election. Secretary of Commerce and a Roosevelt loyalist, Henry Wallace, had considered mounting his own presidential campaign to take up the torch as Roosevelt's successor. There were signs that other loyalists were contemplating presidential runs. These were men who almost certainly would have no intention of actually contesting Roosevelt if they believed he was going to run. The consensus, if there was one, seemed to be that Roosevelt had no intention of running in 1940. However, there were doubts. Gardner, and to a lesser extent Farley, had both mounted their campaigns not simply because they thought Roosevelt wouldn't run, but also because of fears he would try. Neither wanted the two-term tradition broken and believed they might be able to discourage Roosevelt from running if they could mount significant campaigns of their own. Eleanor also had her doubts. Though she came to believe Roosevelt didn't want to run, she also admitted that, for some time, she believed he was concealing his desire for a third term. Also, from outside Roosevelt's inner circle, his most fervent opponents had long maintained that he would run for a third term and that he intended to make himself the nation's dictator. This is still a view that is held by some to a degree, that at no point had Roosevelt ever intended to not be president. A more moderated view of this is that, deep down, he would have liked to run for a third term, but that, for a variety of reasons, possibly including his declining health, doubts about his chances, or concerns over public perception, he did plan to retire. Only something extraordinary could give him the justification he desired. Under this narrative, that justification came late in 1939. In September of that year, Germany invaded Poland, and 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, effectively beginning World War II. Now Roosevelt's supporters were openly calling for a third term. Henry Wallace dropped all signs of presidential ambitions and openly endorsed Roosevelt, saying his, quote, background seems to equip him with exceptional qualifications as a helmsman to steer the country through both foreign and domestic troubles to a safe harbor. Because of strong sentiment towards the two-term tradition, such an idea was still controversial. However, it gradually became less so. The suspicions of men such as Garner and Farley also became gradually more realized, as did the suspicions and worries of Roosevelt's harshest critics. Whether any of this had an impact on Roosevelt or marked a turning point was unclear, and those around him were left to make their own conclusions. Late in the year, Henry Wallace said he was, quote, convinced Roosevelt wanted a third term. The press was even less wise to Roosevelt's motives. His silence became infamous and was a regular topic of political satire. At a dinner event he attended in 1939, he was openly teased about it. He laughed and took it all in good spirits, but didn't leave anyone with any new hints. There were signs that at least by 1939 and early 1940, he still planned to retire. Progress on his presidential library continued. In December of 1939, he even gave a speech at the cornerstone laying ceremony. While he may have been enjoying an increase in popularity in the wake of the war, his health seemed to show no improvements. Reportedly, in February of 1940, he'd slumped forward during a dinner, likely the result of a minor heart attack. However, few, if any, would know the true answer of Roosevelt's motives for the coming months. He only made his motives clear at the 1940 Democratic National Convention, and even then, there was ambiguity. Unlike the other candidates, he hadn't campaigned for the nomination. He didn't even attend the convention, but simply had someone else read a statement before the audience. The statement read, quote, the president has never had, and has not today, any desire or purpose to continue in the office of president, to be a candidate for that office, or to be nominated by the convention for that office. He wishes in earnestness and sincerity to make it clear that all of the delegates in this convention are free to vote for any candidate. Soon, the convention erupted in calls for Roosevelt's candidacy, and he was nominated on the first ballot by an overwhelming margin. Technically, he'd been drafted by his party. One critical newspaper, however, described it as a, quote, shabby pretense that, quote, fooled nobody, and as, quote, one of the shoddiest and most hypocritical spectacles in U.S. history. Today, it's not just critics who believed the drafting was staged, it's the general consensus. By the time of the convention, Roosevelt seemed fully committed to running for a third term, but this doesn't answer the general question of when, why, and for how long it had been planned, or if all of the ambiguity, even early in his second term, was all a pretense. 4 years later, at the 1944 Democratic National Convention, There was no serious question among Democrats of who their candidate would be. The war was still ongoing, and the two-term tradition had already been broken. Had Roosevelt lived through his fourth term, maybe the question of his motive could have been answered via whether or not he would have run for a fifth term. As it stands, there is no definite answer. Some say that with the crisis over, he wouldn't have run a fifth time, with some even arguing he would have resigned following the war's end. With some presidents, understanding the details of their motives and personal decisions is difficult due to a lack of sources, such as when presidents had their writings destroyed upon their deaths. However, Roosevelt was actively interested in having many of his writings preserved. The difficulty with Roosevelt was his personality. Despite being such a prominent voice to Americans via his radio addresses, in private, he was often quiet about his motives and true feelings. Furthermore, he had few close friends, and those he did have didn't have much better insights than everyone else. He once remarked to a longtime friend, quote, "You know I am a juggler, and I never let my right hand know what my left hand does." One possibility mentioned by contemporaries and historians is that Roosevelt used intentional ambiguity as a political weapon. Had he publicly and definitively announced he wouldn't run again during his second term, he may have made himself a lame duck president, as his opponents would know they could effectively wait him out and then overturn his agenda once a less competent president was elected. It's even been suggested that Roosevelt quelled talks among his loyalists about a third term because he feared it would distance Republicans he was looking to work with. Another plausible, though less sensational explanation for his decision to run for a third term is that he failed to find an adequate successor. It was almost customary that presidents finishing their second terms, especially those presidents who were still influential and popular, would endorse a successor. This was the case with Thomas Jefferson, who endorsed his Secretary of State, James Madison, Andrew Jackson, who endorsed his Vice President, Martin Van Buren, and Theodore Roosevelt, who endorsed his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. In each case, the president was essentially passing the torch to someone close to them politically and personally, someone who they trusted to carry out their ideals. As mentioned, Roosevelt had apparently tried to court his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, as was attested to by Hull and others in the administration. Other supposed potential successors included South Carolina Senator James F. Burns, who'd been a strong ally in Congress, and Secretary of Commerce Henry Hopkins, who directed New Deal programs and was, according to some, Roosevelt's closest confidant. Long before the Democratic Convention, each had apparently been discounted for a variety of reasons, including lack of popular appeal, health issues, or simply a lack of interest from the men themselves. Hull was one of the men who simply didn't desire to be president. However, he later claimed that Roosevelt had repeatedly tried to persuade him to run, and that he believed Roosevelt truly wanted someone else to carry the torch so he could retire. There were, of course, two prominent Democrats who were willing to run, Vice President Garner and Postmaster General Farley, but neither were acceptable to Roosevelt. At one meeting, Roosevelt was quoted as saying, quote, "I am sufficiently honest to decline to support any conservative Democrat," which may as well have been a direct attack on Gardner's candidacy. Farley was considered less conservative than Gardner, and despite political differences between him and Roosevelt, the two had worked well together early in Roosevelt's presidency. However, during the second term, their personal relationship had slowly fell apart, making Farley unviable as a successor. This narrative clashes with the more widely accepted view that it was the war that caused Roosevelt to run for a third term. This narrative frames the war as something that influenced his decision, but wasn't the primary motivating factor. It does line up with assessments by Gardner, who cited the reason as being a more comprehensive fear of Roosevelt's that he, quote, was afraid someone would undo his work. Garner, however, suggested something especially self-centered. After Roosevelt had won his third term, an aide recalled Gardner saying, quote, "Roosevelt will be a candidate for a fourth term if he lives," The next time, it will have less open opposition than it had this time. He will never leave the White House except in death or defeat. Years later, long after Roosevelt's death, Gardner, according to the same aide, had said, quote, "Roosevelt would have run as long as he lived and was in office. He wanted history to record him as the man who served longest in the presidency." Gardner isn't the only one with this view. Journalist and writer Eric Black suggested that even Roosevelt's supposed successor searching was a pretense, and that he may have purposefully only asked men he knew would turn it down. As mentioned, Eleanor Roosevelt later admitted that for some time she believed her husband had such a motive. It is worth noting that some admirers of Roosevelt don't necessarily deny this motive, or at least don't rule out that it may have been part of the motivation. However, they generally argue that the good he was able to accomplish outweighed any of his personal desire for control, and some argue that, similar to George Washington, Roosevelt truly was the only man who could have led the nation through that time, and that it wasn't wrong for him to see himself as indispensable. Roosevelt's true motives will likely remain unknown. As mentioned, he was infamously and likely intentionally ambiguous. The ambiguity he fostered might have said as much about his personality as any outright declaration of his intentions would have. He was a man who was a mystery to his allies, his friends, and even his wife, someone who kept everyone guessing all of the way until the end, and even beyond that. Even those who knew him and survived him were left wondering, the same as those who study him today. Based on what is known of Roosevelt's personality, perhaps this is the way he would have wanted it. If you enjoyed this video, you can browse this channel for more videos on United States presidents, from George Washington to Donald Trump, discussing their careers, personal lives, and places in history.